First of all, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a deep honor and responsibility to speak of poetry in Ramallah and in Palestine, the country of the finest poets and writers. The lecture and I come at a time when language betrays and reaches its limits, when poetry almost looks like a luxury. I came to Palestine in a time of profound injustice. From another part of the Mediterranean, a part of the Mediterranean which by the ancient Greeks was considered the end of the world, from an island in between Croatia and Italy. What connects my island and Palestine, among other beloved marks of the Mediterranean, are the dry stone walls, the donkeys, the cats, the vegetation, the smells of carob, of fig, and olive trees. What connects us is poetry, but what also connects us, the island of Ease and Palestine, is the legacy of resistance. This summer and autumn, on an island that was occupied and colonized many times in history, but is now mainly occupied by tourists who consider it paradise, I have been haunted by poetry and by Gaza. So let's first start by poetry. Was sind das für Zeiten, wo ein Gespräch über Bäume fast ein Verbrechen ist, weil es ein Schweigen über so viele Untaten einschließt? What kind of times are these when to talk about trees is almost a crime, because it implies silence about so many horrors? This is the question Bertolt Brecht famously asked in his poem An die Nachgeborenen, which was written between 1934 and 1938 during his Danish exile. This summer and autumn, I asked myself similar questions many times. What kind of times are these when my joy at the olive harvest on my dear Adriatic island is almost a crime because it implies silence about so many olive trees uprooted in Palestine? Yeah, I'm missing my second page, I'm sorry. What kind of times are these when enjoying early autumn on the other side of the Mediterranean feels like a crime, because on this side of the Mediterranean, Palestinians are being slaughtered every single day? What kind of times are these when Jeff Bezos' $500 million super yacht freely cruises the Adriatic Sea while people fleeing death and destruction are drowning in the same sea in a desperate attempt to reach European shores, and at the same time ships with humanitarian aid to Gaza are seized and humanitarians put in prison? Just 2 weeks ago, as we were enjoying the olive harvest on our island, on the other part of the Mediterranean, I was reading about the olive harvest on this side of the Mediterranean, here in Palestine. It wasn't a joyful one. Neither were the previous ones, all these years. You know that much better than me. In October, more than 200 settler attacks have prevented many Palestinians from harvesting olives in the part of Palestine that the colonialist mind calls and still calls the West Bank. Since 1967, almost 1 million of olive trees in Palestine have been uprooted. As you know, and as I know, a tree is never only a tree. A tree is a living being. Actually, in the part where I come from that part of the Mediterranean, there is a saying that the olive tree is like a mother. Dervish would say like a grandmother. And they say vineyards are like a wife because you have to take more care of them. Some of these olive trees, which are being still uprooted in Palestine, are more than a few 100,000 years old, older than Jesus or Prophet Muhammad. They have seen empires rise and empires crash. They have survived World War I and World War II. Today, here in Palestine, they are facing extinction, just like the Palestinians. So it's impossible here in Ramallah not to think and mention Mahmoud Darwish. And the moon did not fall into the well, the opening piece and dialogue of his book, Journal of an Ordinary Grief, from 1973. What are you doing, Father? I'm searching for my heart, which fell away that night. Do you think you will find it here? Where else am I going to find it? I bend to the ground and pick it up piece by piece, just as the woman of the Felahin pick up olives in October, one olive at a time. But you are picking up pebbles. Doing that is a good exercise for memory and perception. Who knows? Maybe these pebbles are petrified pieces of my heart. So as you can see very quickly from the Mediterranean and olives, we come to poetry. And as the olive trees, just like hearts, are being uprooted in Palestine, just as we speak of no other topic than poetry, it is time to take a breath and finally come to Theodor Adorno, namely to his famous dictum that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. What does it mean today, when we have Gaza and the rest of what is happening in Palestine for decades, the Nakba, in front of our eyes and in front of our ears? Surely there is poetry in Gaza, and some brilliant poets have been writing it, and we have been reading it. Surely there is also joy in olive harvest in Palestine, and many courageous families have been picking olives as if they were picking their hearts, piece by piece, just like they did for years and decades and centuries. And surely it's also barbaric, to paraphrase Adorno, and to talk about poetry after Gaza, as if Gaza is finished. When I think of after Gaza, it's impossible not to think of the barbaric Trump Gaza AI-generated video depicting the Gaza Strip as a Dubai-style dystopia with a hummus-eating Elon Musk and shirtless American and Israeli leaders enjoying the beach under the shower of American dollars. No more tunnels, no more fear. A voice sings over a dance beat. Trump Gaza is finally here. So, to respond to Adorno immediately, will there be poetry after Auschwitz? There will certainly be poetry. There might even be AI-generated poetry. Whether that's still poetry, that's another question. The Trump Gaza video premiered in February. In the meantime, we got many after Gaza plans, one worse after the other. So what interests me here is not so much the after. I know, you know, there is no after Gaza. Gaza is now, the Nakba is an ongoing process over the past 76 years. And even if the genocide in Gaza stops immediately now, it will through generations and trauma last forever, or at least through several generations. When I told one of my dear Jewish friends that the title of my talk here today would be Poetry After Gaza, he said he's not a fan after Gaza because it implies there is an after for Gaza. Then he added, Auschwitz had an end, it closed. But did Auschwitz really end? And I'm not talking about poetry now, how Auschwitz and the horrific crimes of the 20th century found an expression precisely in culture and poetry. Neither am I talking about the transgenerational trauma which persists to this day. I'm talking about the mechanism and the process, about the architecture of oppression and what it does deep down with language, in language, and to language. In other words, what we are talking about here tonight is the relation between poetry and genocide. I also come from a country of poets and genocides. Well, I know this is nothing special. So many, perhaps all, nations were built on the erasure of others and otherness. Nation building seems to always come with ethnic cleansing, past and present. And you can be sure where there is nation building, there is also a poet or poets waiting like a loaded gun. So, once upon a time in socialist Yugoslavia, there was a poet. Decades before Yugoslavia would collapse in a sea and rivers of blood, he wrote poems like this. Čujem korake razaranja, grad gori kao tamjan u crkvi. U dimu vidim našu savest između naoružanih grupa, naoružana drveća. Sve što vidim je naoružano, sve je vojska, borba i rat. I hear the footsteps of destruction. The city burns like incense in a church. In the smoke, I see our conscience among armed groups, armed trees. All I see is armed, everything is military, fighting, and war. The name of this poet was Radovan Karadzic. Today, after the brutal collapse of Yugoslavia, that included ethnic cleansing and genocide, we know that Radovan, the poet, literally turned his apocalyptic vision into a dystopian reality for the Bosnian Muslims. So, as we can see, sometimes poetry itself is barbaric, and poetry itself is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Another example, besides Karadzic, is of course the Italian poet and proto-fascist Gabriele D'Annunzio. You know, the guy who occupied Rijeka, or the city which is called Fiume, the guy who basically invented most of the things which Mussolini would take over later. Balcony speeches, men in black, lots of cocaine at that time, sex, a total orgy for those in power. What connects them is precisely a sort of dystopian creation. And don't forget the record holder in mass killings among poets. Question for you, do you maybe know who that is? Well, his name is Josif Vissarionovich Djugashvili Stalin, who was a poet before he became a butcher, just like Karadzic, just like many others. So should we respond to Adorno then that maybe it's even better not to write poetry? Well, the point was never whether a poem can or cannot be written after Auschwitz. Obviously it's possible to write poetry after Auschwitz, just as another genocide is possible, and another genocide, and another, and another. Already in 1967, George Steiner, in his collection of essays, Language and Silence, questioned Adorno's dichotomy of culture and barbarism when he remarked that an SS officer may very well read Goethe or Rilke in the evening, that he can play Bach or Schubert, and still go the next morning to his daily job in Auschwitz. In other words, culture and barbarism not only do not represent opposites, they are intertwined so much that it's sometimes difficult to see what is the difference. Or as Walter Benjamin famously said, there is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Nevertheless, to be fair towards Adorno, his point was similar. Auschwitz shouldn't be viewed as a break in the otherwise positive progress of civilization, but rather as an emblematic and exemplifying moment within the process of what he called total society. So at this stage, I think it's worth reading the full quote from Adorno's cultural criticism, which was published, and it's an interesting date, in 1949. So in the same year after the Nakba started, when he said that that writing poetry after Auschwitz is not possible. Quote, "The more total society becomes, the greater the reification of the mind, and the more paradoxical its effort to escape reification on its own. Even the most extreme consciousness of doom threatens to degenerate into idle chatter. Cultural criticism finds itself faced with the final stage of the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And this corrodes even the knowledge of why it has become impossible to write poetry today. Absolute reification, which presupposed intellectual progress as one of its elements, is now preparing to absorb the mind entirely," unquote. So what we can see here is that Adorno wasn't simply speaking about the impossibility of poetry. Adorno's point was that Auschwitz does not stand alone. It didn't fall from the blue skies. It is part of a historical process. It is the final stage of the dialectics between barbarism and culture. So we are here not simply at the impossibility to write poetry, but what Adorno calls the absolute reification. And what is behind this absolute reification? It is, of course, the European project of modernity and enlightenment. When we say modernity, we should, of course, think of centuries of imperialism and colonialism, racism and speciesism, patriarchy and capitalism. The particularity of Nazi barbarism, with all its inventions and reinventions, is not to be understood as a rupture, but rather as a continuation of this process. So incidentally or not, around the same time when Nakba started and when Adorno said that it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, a great poet from Martinique, A.M. César, already went a step further. In his book Discourse on Colonialism, published in 1950, he explained the origins of European fascism in the following way. Quote, "And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the wrecks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant. They say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarism, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they had absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples," unquote. So as we can see, for the European philosopher, Auschwitz represented a sort of epistemological and ontological break that was at the same time a logical result of European enlightenment and modernity. At the same time, for A.M. César, it was not simply a rupture, but a continuation of what the white man has already done in the colonies. The epistemological and ontological break already happened much earlier. Although massive atrocities certainly happened before, there is an exact date that opens the modern history of genocide. And the date is October 12, 1492, when the white man discovered, as they still say, you know, there is even a museum in Lisbon, the Museum of Discovery. It's still there. I visited it. When the white man discovered the Americas. The indigenous population of the continent, larger than that of Europe at that time, may have lost, by means of combined action of viruses, iron, gunpowder, and paper, treaties, papal bulls, concessions, and of course the Bible, it might have lost something of the order of 95% of its total population. That would correspond, according to some demographers, to a fifth of the planet's population. And even so many centuries later, do we, and when I say we, I mean Europeans, Westerners, do we call it genocide? Do the Americans call it genocide? No. But the peoples of the so-called South, global South, those who have been through various ends of the world, know what it was. In fact, here in Palestine, there was always a link between Palestinian resistance and the indigenous struggles. One of the best examples of this link is Mahmoud Darwish and his prophetic and iconic poem called The Red Indian's Penultimate Speech to the White Man. To come back, does the West call it a Holocaust? No, because it would lead us even further to the ontological and epistemological and ethical break that happened even before, to what man, and not only white man, has done and is still doing to animals, now on industrial level. And no wonder the idea for the concentration camp came from Chicago slaughterhouses. Then Henry Ford saw how useful it is, the assembly line, you know? And after Henry Ford, it was, of course, Adolf Hitler who used the assembly line to produce mass death. And no wonder the word Holocaust derives from the Greek word holocauston, which consists of the word holos, the whole, and kaustos, burned, which meant the burnt offering, and originally referred to the religious animal sacrifice. Or, as an old saying goes, in relation to animals, all people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka. So both from the perspective of indigenous people, of the Americas and other continents, and from the perspective of animals, Adorno's dictum to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric itself. Why is it barbaric itself? Because it appears that it is only with a Holocaust in the West that it became impossible to write poetry. 13 years after Adorno proclaimed that it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, Adorno revised his own thesis in the essay Commitment. Quote, perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence, it might have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems. And then Adorno immediately added, but it is not wrong to raise the less cultural question whether after Auschwitz you can go on living. This time Adorno was right in both things. And it is one poet who proved him right. A Romanian poet who had survived Nazi labor camps and barely escaped death, whose parents had been deported and murdered in Ukraine in 1942. In fact, he became one of the most prominent poets in German language. The language in which his mother had read him Goethe and Schiller, the language in which the people killed his mother, and the language in which he found the means of survival. He would later say, this Romanian poet, there is nothing in the world for which a poet will give up writing, not even if he is a Jew and the language of his poems is German. The name of this poet was, of course, Paul Celan. And it is precisely because of Celan's poetry that Adorno would later soften his thesis. So you will excuse me now, this is not part of the plan, but I will read you the poem in original German, because I think you can understand it even if you don't understand German. And this is the poem which changed Adorno's mind. This is die Todesfuge. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts. Wir trinken und trinken, wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt. Der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland ein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus und es blitzen die Sterne. Er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor. Lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde, er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken die nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit, wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, steckt tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einem, ihr anderen singend und spielt. Er greift nach dem eisernen Gurt, er schwingt seine Augen in Blau. Steckt tiefer die Spatten, ihr einen anderen, spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends. Wir trinken und trinken, ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Er spielt mit den Schlangen, er ruft, spielt süßer den Tod. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, steigt dunkler den Geigen, denn steigt ihr als Rauch in die Luft. Dann habt ihr ein Grab in den Wolken, da liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Seine Augen sind blau, er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er hetzt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Israel. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. As you have perhaps noticed, I changed the poem a bit, because it proves that it's a universal poem. And even if you don't understand German, I think it was precisely Paul Celan who made a point that poetry, the measure of poetry, the measure of rhythm, should be measured in breath. And this is what I think, even with my imperfect German, you could have felt, that it's very difficult to get breath when you're reading this poem. So, Adorno later softened his thesis after the Todesfuge. So he was wrong. But he seemed to have been right that it's difficult to continue living after Auschwitz. And it is precisely Paul Celan who was the best example of this. Namely, Paul Celan drowned in the Seine in Paris in 1970. It's still unclear, but perhaps it was probably suicide. And it's not only Paul Celan. Jeanne Marie, Primo Levi, and many others who committed suicide because they couldn't live after Auschwitz. Yet, as horrific their suffering must have been, it is exactly thanks to them that after Auschwitz, we have poetic creations that were able to transmit, if not to come to terms with it, because it's impossible to come to terms with it, they succeeded to transmit the horrors of the concentration camps. Did they prevent Gaza or another genocide? That's another question. And the answer is simple: no. Surprise, surprise, it was Adorno who, after writing back in 1949 that writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, in the same passage used a metaphor that brings us directly back to the future, from Auschwitz to Gaza. Quote, "In the open-air prison which the world is becoming, it is no longer so important to know what depends on what, such is the extent to which everything is one." Unquote. So what is the role of poetry today? Not after Gaza, but while Gaza is happening. Perhaps we could respond by a poem by the Palestinian-American poet Noor Hindi. The title of this poem is, I love the title, "Fuck your lecture on craft, my people are dying." Colonizers write about flowers. I tell you about children throwing rocks at Israeli tanks seconds before becoming daisies. I want to be like those poets who care about the moon. Palestinians don't see the moon from jail cells and prisons. It's so beautiful, the moon. They're so beautiful, the flowers. I pick flowers for my dead father when I'm sad. He watches Al Jazeera all the day. I wish Jessica would stop texting me Happy Ramadan. I know I'm American because when I walk into a room, something dies. Metaphors about death are for poets who think ghosts care about sound. When I die, I promise to haunt you forever. One day, I'll write about flowers like we own them. So, if you would ask what's the role of poetry today as Gaza is happening, and not only Gaza, we are here in the so-called West Bank. And what's the role of even love poetry or poems about flowers? We should again quote Mahmoud Darwish. If I write love poems, I resist the conditions that don't allow me to write love poems. Or, the siege will persist until we teach our enemies models of our finest poetry. Or, where are you from, brother? From Gaza. What did you do? I threw a grenade at the conqueror's car, but I blew myself up instead. And they arrested me and charged me with attempted suicide. You confessed, of course. Not exactly. I told them the attempted suicide didn't succeed, so they liberated me out of mercy and sentenced me to life. But you were intending to kill, not to commit suicide. It seems you don't know Gaza. Distance there is an imaginary thing. I don't understand. It seems you don't know Gaza. Where are you from? From Haifa. And what did you do? I threw a poem at the conqueror's car and it blew them up. And they arrested me and charged me with mass murder. One of Croatia's best contemporary poets, Marko Pogačar, calls poetry, similarly to Dervish, a bomb in language, a micro-explosion with potentially devastating effects, saying at the same time that, quote, "It's hard to say if the message will ever reach anyone, if the fire will quickly die out, or if the conflagration will ravage primeval forests, possibly reaching minefields and setting off a chain of explosions. But such an act of pyromania is a duty which ensures the faithfulness of poetry itself." Unquote. But what happens when language reaches its limits, either through experiencing the atrocities or through witnessing them? What happens when the language of the colonizer penetrates so deep into your body like poison that it's not your language anymore? The Palestinian author and a dear friend of mine, Adania Shibli, had described her experience of losing her language due both the atrocities in Gaza And after she was, as they call it today, cancelled or disinvited from the Frankfurt Book Fair, where she was supposed to receive a literary award for her novel Minor Detail. As she noted in a text essay published in 2024 in the Berlin Review called Once the Monster Was So Kind, words have abandoned her. She said that she can't speak anymore. Among other important things, she describes, quote, how in Palestine, Israel, you grow up realizing that language is beyond being a tool to be instrumentalized to communicate or tell. It can be attacked, it can be broken, and it can be abused. The question is, how can you trust language when it also causes you pain, when it deserts you, and when you must face cruelty alone, speechless? This is why the technique Schibli uses in her novel Minor Detail is so brilliant and so unheimlich at the same time. The first part of the novel is told in a cold-blooded language, describing the crimes committed by Israeli soldiers in 1949, the same year Adorno had his famous dictum. So in 1949, Israeli soldiers kidnapped a Palestinian Bedouin girl and gang raped her, and then killed her. In the second part of the novel, we meet a Palestinian woman in contemporary Palestine, motivated by a minor detail, seeking to investigate the crime and following the traces through erased Palestine. What makes the novel so unheimlich is both the language itself, how it varies in the part 1 and part 2, but also the structure of the novel, interwoven with minor details such as the persisting smell of gasoline, continuous barking of dogs, spiders in the corner. After reading the first section of Minor Detail, we can identify these details in the second part of the book. Yet, the young woman investigating the crime remains unaware of the traces of the past that are woven into the present, or the other way around. Ultimately, there is no difference between the past and the present anymore. The erasure of Palestine is continuous, and the silencing is never ending. Today, here in Palestine, but also in many other places of the world which are with Palestine, we know very well that not even the dead are safe from the enemy, that not even burying your beloved ones is permitted, that not even mourning is possible. When children in Gaza learn the grammar of death before they learn their mother's tongue or even meet their mother, we sink a step deeper into the abyss. Not even the newborn or even unborn will be safe from the enemy if he is victorious. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. So poetry. What's the role of poetry today amidst the ongoing horror? The Italian philosopher Franco Berardo Biffi develops a metaphor of poetry as the only line of escape from suffocation. Quote, "Power is today based upon abstract relations between numerical entities. While the sphere of finance is ruled by algorithms that connect fractals of precarious labor, the sphere of life is invaded by flows of chaos that paralyze the social body and stifle breathing into suffocation. There is no political escape from this trap, only poetry, as the excess of semiotic exchange can reactivate breathing. Only poetry will help us through the apocalypse that is already raging as an effect of decades of financial absolutism." Unquote. So what is poetry? Bifo himself says this question cannot be answered. I cannot say what poetry is because actually poetry is nothing. I can only try to say what poetry does. What poetry does. Then of course Bifo gives a negative definition of poetry. Actually, poetry is the act of language that cannot be defined, as to define means to limit. And poetry is precisely the access that goes beyond the limits of language, which is to say beyond the limits of the world itself. Only a phenomenology of poetical events, says Bifo, can give us a map of poetical possibilities. So, at the end of this poetical exploration, let us take a look at a poetical event par excellence, An example I owe to Adania Shibli, who has been investigating precisely this example I will now mention in the context of mistranslation and misbehavior. Date of this political event is the following one. Spring 1970, a couple of weeks before the American invasion of Cambodia. Main protagonists of this event, Jean Genet, Edward Said, and the Black Panthers. Jean Genet, of course, the French novelist, playwright, poet, who in his early youth was a vagabond and a criminal, and later in 1968, he was an activist. In 1970, the Black Panthers invited him to the United States, where he stayed for 3 months. After that, he would come to Palestine, where he would stay 6 months. He would also secretly meet Yasser Arafat in Amman, and he would also be one of the first foreigners to enter Shatila refugee camp after the massacre. Edward Said, well, I don't have to present you Edward Said, except that I found out just before the lecture that his surname and my first name have the same meaning. Srećko comes from the Croatian word happiness or luck, Sreća, and Said also means lucky. It's a nice coincidence. Black Panthers, I guess I also don't have to explain too much, but anyway, it was a far-left Marxist-Leninist black power political organization founded in 1966 in one of the most progressive cities in the United States, in Oakland. Place of action of this poetical event, Columbia University, United States. Plot of this poetical event, as follows. As he was heading towards a rally for the Black Panthers, Edward Said met one of his students who would be Jean Genet's simultaneous interpreters. Together, they went to the protest where Said would for the first time see Genet to speak. So I'm quoting now Said, which is from his text on the late work of Jean Genet. It was an unforgettable scene for 2 reasons. One was the deeply moving sight of Genet himself, who stood at the center of a large crowd of panthers and students. He was planted in the middle of the steps with his audience all around him rather than in front of him, dressed in his black leather jacket, blue shirt, and I think scruffy jeans. He seemed absolutely at rest, rather like the portrait of him by Giacometti, who catches the man's astounding combination of storminess, relentless control, and almost religious stillness. I'm continuing to quote. The other memorable aspect of that rally was the stark contrast between the declarative simplicity of Genet's French remarks in support of the Panthers and the immensely Baroque embellishment of them by my student. Genet would, for example, say, "The blacks are the most oppressed class in the United States." This would emerge in the translator's colorful ornamentation as something like, "In this motherfucking son of a bitch country in which reactionary capitalism oppresses and fucks over all the people, not just some of them," and so on. Genet stood through this appalling tirade unruffled, and even though the tables were sufficiently turned that the translator and not the speaker dominated the proceedings, the great writer never so much as blinked. When Edward Said would meet Jean Genet the next time in Beirut in 1972, he asked him about this poetical event and what he thought about this mistranslation. Genet seemed calm. I may not have said all these things, but he added, "Je les pensais." I thought them. Thank you very much. And I hope the translator there also translated the whole lecture like, fuck this and that and so on, but you will tell me. I think this red button. A bit longer. It's okay.
Okay. Good evening. You made it very difficult for me.
Trust me, it's much more difficult for me to speak here.
Reading your words. بدي أحكي بالعربي وأنت
You speak Arabic.
I'll speak Arabic.
Okay, I'll take translation and I hope you say fuck every time when you say something else.
والله يعين المترجم على الموضوع. أوكي. يعني قراءة النص قراءة النص والاستماع المحاضرة بيزيد صعوبة فتح نقاش مع الورقة ومعك. أنا بدي أبلش من الانتقالات. أول شيء أنا مش شاعر ولا بشتغل في الأدب، ولكن مهتم واستمتعت في القراءة، فشكرا جزيلا. بدي أنتقل بدي أسأل عن الانتقالات من الإشارات اللغوية، يعني من لحظة الزيتون للوصول لضرورة كتابة الشعر في وايل غزة، مش أفتر غزة أو مش ما بعد غزة. هاي الانتقالات والانتقالات ما بين الشخصيات، الشعر لا يحصلنا بهذا المعنى. الشعر بذاته يصبح أداة، وممكن يكون فاشي وممكن يكون شعر بحثا عن الحياة. يعني هاي التأمل فيصبح الشعر بذاته يعني غير مهم. سؤال إنه writing poetry by itself يعني is a questionable, the category of poetry itself. واحدة من يعني I need your reflection on this particular point. If poetry itself is there is no particular أو أنا بنتقل من الإنجليزي للعربي. إذا ما في في الشعر بذاته شيء، يعني شو أهميته؟ ليش مهم؟ إذا ممكن يكون هو ريكورد للبربرية أو للهمجية زي ما هو ريكورد للحضارة، هو بذاته ببطل إشي مهم. فهاي أول ملاحظة بحب يعني أستفسر عنها. بدنا يعني نجاوب على واحد سؤال يعني ملاحظة ولا نجمعهم مع بعض؟ What do you think?
I think question by question is easier because I might forget.
So this is the first point if you want to reflect upon.
Yeah, thanks also for joining me. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was also one of my intentions with the lecture, to show that poetry on itself can be many things. It can be poetry by Stalin, it can be poetry by Mao Zedong, whom I didn't mention, but was another one who was writing poems, D'Annunzio, Karadzic, and I'm sure Zionists are writing poetry as well. Whether that's good poetry or not, that's another question. Like Karadzic's poetry was pretty bad poetry. D'Annunzio didn't really have that bad poetry. But I wouldn't agree that poetry itself is insignificant. I think what happens, if I understood right...
The category of poetry.
Okay. Yeah. I think what poetry does is precisely to go beyond the limits of language. To illustrate it with an example, there is one Godard's movie which I really like. It's not a typical Godard movie. It's a science fiction movie by Jean-Luc Godard, and it's called Alphaville. It's a movie where Roland Barthes was supposed to have an act, because it's a movie about semiotics. It's a movie about a totalitarian society where emotions are prohibited, where even to speak of love is prohibited, where poetry is prohibited. It's a society, a society which is more... The movie is from the 70s, but it is as if the movie is about our today's age. It's a totalitarian society governed by the algorithm and by pure mathematics. And what you can see, what is the only subversive instance in the movie is precisely poetry, because the algorithm doesn't know what to do with poetry. I mean, that's what I also mentioned in the lecture. Of course, you can now today go to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT can write something which resembles poetry, but that brings us to the question, so what is poetry then? We obviously understand that what AI or ChatGPT is writing is not poetry. You know, it sounds okay, the syntax is okay, the metaphors and so on, but there is something missing. And I'm not saying now, I also don't want to now go into the anthropocentrism and narcissism of the human race, that the machine will never learn to write poetry. I don't know, maybe it will. But I think the point I was trying to make is to show, on the one hand, that poetry can be both things. It can be a liberating tool, and it can also be a tool of oppression or a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what I think why poetry today is so important, and especially when I read Palestinian writers and poets, is that I mean, it's no relief, of course, I know, it's no comfort, it doesn't solve anything, but it is a way to get out of the atrocities and the horrors, and to try, in the same way Paul Celan tried, in the same way many other poets tried, to not to understand, but to take out of this deep stone which is inside of us, and which the stone tries to speak, to put it like that in a metaphor. So I think in that sense poetry is immensely important, and if there wasn't poetry in Gaza today, it would, to paraphrase Mahmoud, who is here in the audience, we talked about it the other day, it would be a wasteland. So I think in that sense, and when I say poetry, it's not just poetry, it's poiesis, if you want the Greek, it's artistic creation.
Okay, thank you. الملاحظة الثانية في اليوم يعني من غزة في كثير من الكتابات، وهي الكتابات ما بعرف إذا ممكن نسميها شعر بالمعنى إنه هي مرات كثير أو جزء كبير من هاي الكتابات مكتوبة على السوشيال ميديا من ناس يعني بشكل سريع، هي مش ريفايند بمعنى مش مفكر فيها ومتأمل فيها، وهاي الأشعار يعني في ورقة غير منشورة أو يعني ما سيحدث يعني سيأتي، دكتورة رانيا جواد تصف الكلمات اللي بتيجي من غزة بأنها يعني يفكر فيها باعتبارها سحرية، كونها تصف الغير قابل للوصف، فهي تقرأ باعتبارها poetic. في هاي الحالة يعني الشعر يعني في نماذج مختلفة، يبدو أنه كمان الشعر في لحظة وايل غزة من غزة له خصوصية. ما بعرف إذا في عندك يعني اطلاع على يعني نماذج شعرية موجودة حاليا أو طلعت من غزة من ناس تحت يعني في لحظة الجينوسايد واقعين تحت العنف الاستعماري المباشر أو همجية الحداثة زي ما بتوصفها.
Yeah, I mean, I quoted one. Of course, she's an American Palestinian poet, but I have been reading poets from Gaza, and as you said, I think it's an important point. Most of those poems we have been reading on social networks, and I think this is a big change, and it's a kind of democratizing change. Although we also have to be aware that it's happening through the tools of the master, whether it's Twitter, Meta, Instagram, or all the other big tech companies which are involved in the genocide in Gaza. But to try to answer also from my experience from the part of the world where I come from, which is not necessarily Croatia, but it was the part which was called Socialist Yugoslavia. During the siege of Sarajevo, which was the longest siege of a city after the Second World War. I think it lasted 3 or 4 years, with shellings and without the possibility to get out and so on. It was precisely poetry as poiesis, arts, which was crucial for people to survive. And I'm not talking now about Lebbeus Woods, the famous architect, or Susan Sontag, who came to Sarajevo. She staged Waiting for Godot. I'm talking about the people who were in Sarajevo. And I met some of them, I have read their testimonies, and when you read it, it's fascinating. So, for instance, they describe how, when there was a play in an underground shelter while Sarajevo was, occupied and shelled, On the stage, there were the actors playing something, for instance, Shakespeare, and in the audience, there was the audience. But the actors and the audience, both of them described there was no wall, like there might be a wall here, an invisible wall between the audience and the stage. The actors were freezing, the audience was freezing, the bombs were falling on both of them. And when you hear their testimonies, what they're saying is this was the most creative, most fulfilling artistic experience of their lives. I'm not saying we need war, we need a siege or genocide in order to value art more, but I'm saying that in these moments, this is a good example. I think Sarajevo, it is poetry, it is art, culture which becomes so important. I mean, another stupid example maybe is COVID. You know, in which sense, when COVID happened and all the institutions shut down, it was, you know, it was precisely this artistic creation, culture, or poetry, which was so important. And there is one, I'll end by that example by an actor from Sarajevo. I saw it in a documentary. So he just got a child. His wife and his child are sitting here after I don't know which year of the atrocities in Sarajevo, and he's on the phone. And on the phone is a guy from a country, I think it's Sweden or something like that, a rich European country, and he tells him, oh, I have good news for you. I arranged for you to escape, finally. And you know what the actor responds? He says, I don't want to go. This is the best time of my life. And you know, I can't say that, of course, but someone who is in this situation and who just got a child who might be killed by a sniper as it happened, you know, recently it was found out that more than 2,000 people from Italy, from other European countries were coming to Sarajevo, were coming to the hills. They would pay tens of thousands of dollars and they could get a sniper in the hand and shoot people. I mean, there is this famous scene, you can again find it on YouTube, from Paweł Pawlikowski's, that's the Oscar-winning great director from Poland, who made a documentary about Serbian epics. And you can see a Russian poet again, with a Serbian poet, Radovan Karadzic. The name of the Russian poet is Limonov. And he takes a gun, and in the documentary, he shoots people. So, yeah, I just finished here, sorry. What can I say?
A third point I would like your reflection upon, like, يعني, would you like? Okay,
I put this.
Yeah.
In my ear.
بفضل أحكي بالعربي. ممكن نفكر في الشعر باعتباره جزء من التشافي, healing.
Well, I don't know if you know what Radovan Karadzic was doing after he was a poet. Do you know? Anyone knows? He was a fucking healer in Belgrade, hiding, and he was healing people. So, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether it's healing, but I know that anyone, I mean, for me also, if I can be personal now, coming to Palestine was a very emotional thing. And what helped me is precisely writing and preparing this lecture, which is not a poetical thing, of course. Maybe it was to some degree, I don't know. But it helped me. Whether it healed me, I don't know. What is healing me, and I also don't know whether it's healing me, is to see you in the eyes, is to talk to you, is to have been to the Birzeit University today and yesterday at the Congress of Decolonization of Palestine. You know, to be, as we have been, our delegation to the settlement, in front of the settlements, Psigot and others, looking at the prison where more than hundreds of children from 13 to 20 are imprisoned. It's not healing, but it's materializing something, and it gives us a sort of big responsibility. Yeah.
Poetry and archival documentation.
What's the question? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
When it comes to genocide, when it comes to atrocities, you have poetry and you have documentation.
I think I know where you're going. I mean, as much, you know, here with us in the first row is a legendary journalist, Ewan McCaskill from The Guardian, and many others as well. I think it's really important to have the facts, to have a kind of archive, if you want, of the atrocities. You know, McCaskill was also working together with Edward Snowden, and these revelations about the surveillance in the United States, not just United States, were very important. At the same time, both of us were befriended and were also advocating with some other people in this room for the liberation of Julian Assange. And you know, the main motto of WikiLeaks was, "The truth will set you free." And this is about facts and about archives. And of course, we need this work of courageous journalists, publishers, and whistleblowers. But as we could have seen also with the fate of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, I don't think this is enough. I mean, we could also go a bit deeper into it. Of course, at the stage when WikiLeaks published Collateral Murder, which is about the US atrocities in Afghanistan when they killed innocent people and Reuters journalists, and they published the video of the Apache helicopter murdering the people. Of course, at that time, we didn't have social networks, you couldn't read about it, and it was massively important, and it created a kind of momentum of humanity, you know, NGOs, people who were fighting for the truth, and so on. But almost 2 decades later, we see the genocide in Gaza every bloody day on our phones. We scroll through it before we go to sleep. We scroll through it when we wake up. And this factuality, unfortunately, is not enough. And in this sense, I think we need poetical creation. When I say poetical creation, I don't mean you take a pen and you write a poem. No, I think what is necessary is to broaden our sense of imagination, is to speak in a language the colonizer doesn't understand. It's, you know, because what I also tried to show in the lecture is how even unconsciously we deeply integrate the language of the colonizer. A famous German linguist and philologist, Viktor Klemperer, who wrote a book called Lingua Tertia Imperii, the language of the Third Reich, had a perfect sentence. He says, the language is sometimes as small doses of poison. They enter your body and then suddenly they take over fully your body. And this is the language of the colonizer. This is, you know, when Stalin, for instance, a poet, says that one death is a tragedy, but million is just statistics. And I'm afraid this is what is also happening to Gaza, you know, it becomes statistics. And in that sense, I think it is so important to hear the voices from Gaza itself, to hear in which way people are broadening their sense of imagination in the most horrible conditions we can imagine. In this sense, I think there needs to be a kind of dialectics, if you want, between the factuality, between the facts, and between something which is more than facts. And if I can go a step further, I also don't think that the facts itself can mobilize. I don't think that facts are necessarily a mobilizing factor. You know, another example, I named it already, Gabriele D'Annunzio. He didn't mobilize the crazy Italians to attack the city of Fiume by facts or by, I mean, there were no facts. He mobilized them by craziness. He mobilized them by his poetical madness. In the same way, Trump, there are no facts when Trump speaks. It's just poetical madness again. I mean, if you read his tweets, maybe one day someone will say this was a sort of poetry. Definitely, it's a very specific style. Short sentences, I mean, no one else has this kind of style of poetry, if you want. But he didn't mobilize people by facts. And I think this is something which is to also have a sort of self-criticism, because I belong to the left. What is missing on the left? You know, it is precisely to offer not just, you know, a program, this is our Green New Deal, or I don't know what, and then people will read 100 pages and they will say, yeah, we can manage economy in this way or that way. No, people will not read a program of 100 pages, you know. Trump's one tweet is more powerful than the most developed program by the most brilliant people in the world. So what I think, what is really missing is this kind of poetical creation. To come back to history, to the part of the world where I come from, you know that during the partisan struggle in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia was on the one hand occupied by fascists, occupied by Nazis, there was a puppet regime, fascist regime of the Ustasha in Croatia, there were the Chetniks in Serbia. At the same time, during the guerrilla fight, I mean, this was the guerrilla fight when Che Guevara in 1959 came for the first time to visit Yugoslavia and had a conversation with Tito. He said, if we knew about your revolution, we would have made our revolution in Cuba even earlier. And you know that at that time, so that was already a guerrilla fight. You know, it's not just the Cuban Revolution. You know, if you take Yugoslavia, some people here have been there. You know, the Bosnian mountains, the rivers. It's a crazy environment for a guerrilla fight against all odds. In the end, what was happening during the war, and I think that during the guerrilla fight against the Nazis and the fascists and the collaborationists, was that tens of thousands poems were created. There are people mainly in Slovenia who have been tracing it back and so on. And these poems don't have an authorship even. That's also very important. These were a kind of collected. It was not so important as it is today. We are in an institution here as well. You know, the ego, the narcissism, there must be an authorship and so on. No, that was not important. There was tens of thousands of poems, and this was the poetical creation which sort of helped. But what was also there, to not go into this kind of romanticizing of poetry, was self-organization. You know that at the time when the guerrilla war was happening, they were establishing schools in mountains, in caves. They had theater plays, they had orchestras. You know, we are relatively close here to the Sinai Desert, relatively closer than Croatia is. I don't know if you know the history of El Shat. El Shat was the place where more than 30,000 refugees from Yugoslavia, so it's the different way. Today, the refugees come from this part of the world, and then they mainly drown in the Mediterranean Sea. At that time, it was the other way around. More than 30,000 refugees who were saved from the Nazis went through the island of Vis, which I mentioned at the beginning, and through Bari, and to the Sinai Desert in El Shat. You know what happened? So this camp was originally administered by the British, similar to the situation here. And you know what happened the very next day when the Brits came and they saw the refugee camp? So what they wanted to do, of course, as they always wanted to do it, they wanted to manage the camp. They came there, and they saw that already the next day, the refugees from Yugoslavia were publishing their own newspaper. Very soon, they established schools, they established orchestras, they established hospitals. So it was a self-educational process, if you want, where self-management, which was the specific characteristic of Yugoslav real existing socialism, which didn't exist in Soviet Union or other countries, it was self-management already before self-management was created after the split with Tito and Stalin in 1948. So I think besides, you know, to kind of not go into the romanticizing of poetry, I think what is important at the same way is this building of autonomy. To, at the same time, while the struggle is happening against all odds, you know, in Croatia, concentration camps, Jasenovac, one of the most famous ones, were operating. At the same time, the partisans, educated people, they were writing poems, they were building a society that was already here, and it would come later, and it would be realized later. So besides poetry, if I can say, you know, a more political point, I think it's very important to build autonomy, to build self-organization, and at the same time, this is also why education is so important. And this is also what we learned today at Birzeit University, listening to the students from Birzeit University. This is why the Zionist project is trying to do everything to destroy education of the Palestinians. You know, this is the reason, because if you destroy the preconditions and the possibility of education, you are destroying the future. And so they know very well why they are doing it, and they know very well what they are doing.
طيب أنا بدي إذا في ملاحظات من الجمهور عشان أو تساؤلات.
يعطيك العافية علاء، أهلا وسهلا. أنا بس يعني حاب الشيء الممتع في الجلسة إنه يعني هذه يعني بتتيح للواحد شوية إنه هيك يمارس نوع من التفلسف الجيد إذا بدنا نحكي يعني. فسؤالي لك إنه لو بدلنا كلمة poetry ب painting أو الارت أو ميوزك مثلا، أو إذا بدك بنروح أبعد، لو بدلنا poetry بالنظرة للعالم بعد غزة، بدءا من النظرة الدينية في الأديان لحد ما إذا بدك الناشونال ناراتيف، لشو طبيعة الاجتماع الإنساني اللي لازم يكون، شكل الاجتماع الإنساني لازم يكون. على كل حال بس يعني هذا سؤال، إنه لو بدلنا البويتري بواحدة من هاي الأشياء شو بيختلف الجواب؟ شو بيختلف على يعني شو بيختلف الطرح؟ أوكي. هذا سؤال. سؤالي الثاني، شو قصدك باللغة لما احنا بدنا نروح أبعد من اللغة؟ يعني احنا بدنا نروح أبعد من اللغة، أنت بتحكي عن يعني احنا كفلسطينيين مثلا في أي لغة احنا بنعيش؟ هذا سؤال مهم. وانت هل بتحكي عن اللغة ك ست موجودة في الدماغ الإنساني الجمعي، فبتحكي أنت عن بويتري كنوع من الكولكتيف utterances إذا بدك، collective utterances أكثر من إنها language بمعنى language. عرف لي شو اللانجوج اللي إحنا لازم نروح أبعد منها في الشعر، وليش الشعر بالتحديد اللي بده ياخذني أبعد من اللغة؟ شكرا.
Thank you. I'll try to respond. The translator didn't catch everything, so I hope I catched and will mistranslate you in the same way. Jean Genet's translator mistranslated him. I hope I understood. What is the difference, if I got you right, if instead of poetry we put painting or music? Well, I think there is no difference. That's why I said we should speak maybe of poiesis, the Greek term for artistic creation, if you want. What immediately comes to my mind is Picasso's Guernica. You know, there is this famous anecdote when a Nazi officer came and approached Picasso and asked him, what have you done? You know, looking at Guernica. And you know what Picasso responded? You have done this. So in this sense, I think, you know, painting, we could speak about many other paintings. We could speak about Basquiat, for instance, in which way he approached black power and the discrimination in the United States. We could speak of contemporary creation, painters, music. I'm very grateful that yesterday our organizers led us to the Edward Said Musical Conservatory. And at the beginning, on the stage, there were 30 children of, you know, from 6 to 12, one in a keffiyeh. Their parents were in the audience. And it was a remarkable experience because what poiesis, painting, music, poetry can do is precisely to universalize. You know, I don't need to understand the language. I don't need to understand Arabic or the songs they were singing, but I was immediately touched more than if I have read 10,000 academic articles about the suffering of Palestinian people or about the hopes of the Palestinian people. So in that sense, I think when I speak of poetry, don't read it or understand it just as poetry. It can be also music, it can be painting, it can be planting if you want. Planting of seeds, especially in the context of Palestine where olive trees are uprooted. I think, you know, planting an olive tree and caring for an olive tree, I'm talking from my own perspective as someone who was in an olive harvest a few weeks ago. I was lucky enough that there was no settlers attacking me. But planting and caring for an olive tree is also a sort of poetry, if you want. Your second question, that was the part where I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. In what language and what is language and how can poetry or how should poetry go beyond language? Well, I studied linguistics besides philosophy. I'm a very bad linguist. I must say immediately, I had to learn Indo-European and all this kind of, syntax and all this kind of stuff. But I went mainly into semiotics. The theory of science, which goes back to the American tradition of Charles Sanders Peirce and the French or Swiss tradition of Ferdinand de Saussure, which would later come to the post-structuralists, mainly Roland Barthes. And well, the main point of post-structuralists was that there is no outside of language. And I think this thesis is still correct, although some of these theories were perverted later, but let us not go there. But I think, that's also the point of Wittgenstein, if you want, on the limits of language, that we cannot really exit our language. And I think what poetry is, not what poetry is, but what poetry does, is precisely to enable us to somehow, miraculously, if you want, to go not outside, there is no outside, but to go beyond, to create, Roland Barthes has a beautiful book, Sad, Fourier, Loyola. It's a beautiful book where he talks about, where he invents a term which is called logothesis. The logos, language, and thesis, the creation of language, where he puts the Sade, Fourier and Loyola together, and where he shows that by creating language, they created worlds. If you take Fourier, for instance, this kind of utopian project, which is quite relevant today, he, through language, and the Sade, who was writing with his blood in the cell, through this language, they created worlds. In the same way, the Zionist project, through language and through narrative, creates a world and an erasure of another world. So I would never underestimate the power of language. Actually, I think we should take it very seriously and understand, as my friend Marko Pogačar, the poet from Croatia, said, that language is a bomb, and that language sometimes can be a sort of pyromania and can put off a fire which can be a virus. Unfortunately, this virus is now the Zionist project. But what is happening now, I came from Europe, what we can see in the last months is a massive mobilization around Europe. A general strike is just now again announced in Italy. There was one of the biggest general strikes when some flotilla members, I can't say if some are here in the room or not, because you never know if the enemy is listening or watching, when this incredible event happened, that 50 ships, some of them came even 30, 40 miles to Gaza. I don't know whether the people of Gaza could see them. I guess not. But when that happened, more than 2 million people on the streets of Italy had a general strike. Protests are happening, even in my country, which is a pretty reactionary country, Croatia. But when you look at the ordinary, so-called ordinary population of these countries, of Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, all around the world, not to mention the global south, which didn't have this kind of European problems. Should we call it a genocide or not? This kind of shit. To paraphrase, I hope the translator translates it into merd or something like that. So they didn't have these problems. In the global south, it was quite clear, precisely for the reasons I mentioned in the lecture, that this is a genocide. And it doesn't really matter, except for international law and such things I really don't believe in, how we call it. So I think the narrative is changing. The narrative around the world is changing. And I think we can see precisely with the situation of Palestine how important language and narrative is. Because the fight, the level of struggle happens first on the level of narrative. And through narrative, in the same way the Nazis said that the Jews are rats or that they are this or that, through this narrative they succeeded to objectify, to commodify the victims. In the same way, humans are commodifying animals, if you want. How many times are you on a highway and you see a truck full of animals and you don't think that this is a concentration camp? Because we are in power, and who fucks the animals? James Bridle is here in the audience. I'm really glad that he is. He wrote a beautiful book on ways of being, where he shows that not even among animals, not just among animals, but also among plants, you have sorts of intelligence which is much more sophisticated than the intelligence of humans. You know, when a fire sets off in a forest, the trees communicate to themselves. I mean, we could go back in history, read Peter Kropotkin, Mutual Aid, which is the best criticism of Darwin, where he actually showed that people also understand Darwin wrongly, that it's not just about the survival of the fittest, but Kropotkin shows that Darwin himself said that those species who cooperate have the biggest chances of evolutionary progress. And he names bees, he names ants, he names birds. You know, thousands of birds. I see them, not thousands, but I see birds. For instance, last month, usually there are not many birds on the island where I am from, but you see birds who migrate, you know, twice a year. You know what it takes for thousands of birds to gather twice a year somewhere without mobile phones, without WhatsApp and so on, to organize and to go to thousands of kilometers away. So in that way, I think genocide, not just genocide, but mass killing also of animals, of plants and so on, starts by language. You know that slave owners in the Americas would have sex in front of the slaves without any shame. You know why? For the same reason most of us or you don't have any shame if you fuck in front of a cat or a dog. Because they're not humans. They are just some stupid objects who, you know, bark or whatever, you know. So the objectivation of those who are the other, who have to be erased, starts with language. And in that way, I think also liberation has to start from language.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Srećko. I don't know whether I have a question, but maybe I want to ask your reflection on something that I experienced and I'm talking about. I'm from, for those, I mean, you know, but I'm from Ghent University in Belgium, professor there, and we had one of a very long encampment at our university that in the end forced our university to implement a de facto boycott of Israeli institutions. One of the things that struck me now listening to you is that, first of all, the building that was occupied was renamed as the building, the Refat al-Harir building, named after the Gazan poet who was killed by the Israeli soldiers. But also, because the previous person mentioned music, and you said, yeah, it's not just poetry, but I want to talk about this importance of poetical creation for mobilization. One of the crucial moments in the occupation was not necessarily the occupation of the encampment. It was not necessarily the occupation of the building itself, but it was located next to the rectoral office. And at a moment where the whole standoff seemed to be going nowhere, students at a certain point decided not just to occupy the building, but to enter the rectoral office and attempt to occupy the rectoral office. And it was denounced as violence. The police came in and threw out the 10 students that were entering that office. And in a reaction, because everybody was afraid that the real building that was occupied was going to be evicted, and the rector had announced that he was going to evict the whole encampment, students came back together in the encampment with a lot of allies and started singing in a moment of trying to unite the encampment and create a moment of solidarity. But the interesting point there, and maybe I want your reflection on it, is that it created this moment of unification and strengthened the encampment, but at the same time, it also created a lot of frustration, because the whole point of singing was to show to the outside world and the journalists that were present that, look, we're not a violent encampment, we're just a bunch of peaceful students coming together and we sing. And a lot of students felt really frustrated because they said, fuck this shit of trying to be non-violent. We need full confrontation in order to force our university to cave in and implement the boycott. So that moment of music and that moment of coming together was at the same time also a moment of creating a rift and a tension within, and a friction within in the encampment, where some of them said, no, it's not the time for music, it's the time for a full confrontation. And in the end, it played a huge role, that particular moment, in actually forcing our rector to cave in. But I'm just want to see whether you have any reflections about that, also the tension that poetical creation can create.
Thanks. I don't think it's an either or. You know, this is the most quoted quote by Emma Goldman. I don't want to be part of your revolution if I can't dance. And I think that's quite right. Of course, on the one hand, if you take the hippies, of course, it all turned into music and this kind of daily spectacle, which lost its political force. So I understand the danger that it could go in that direction. But speaking of music, you know, you have been dealing with colonial history, the Haitian example. You know what happened when the soldiers, the French soldiers, attacked the Haitian people. The Haitian people started to sing the Marseillaise. So they understood, and then some French soldiers joined them. They understood the French Revolution more seriously than the French themselves. And I think this is the power of the universal character of music, but also of revolution. So in that sense, I don't think it's either or, but we should always be very careful that this kind of events, I've been personally to Zuccotti Park in 2011, I think, 11, yeah, when Occupy Wall Street was happening. And that also, with all positive examples of reinvention of what Christian Ross would call the communal form, it also very quickly turned into a kind of carnival, where where this kind of poetic creation becomes more important than confrontation. But if you would ask me, ideally, we should have both. Not either or, but both. You can have a confrontation and sing. That's not a rare case in revolutionary history. But a confrontation without singing, without dancing, I think it's not something where I would love to take part in.
It was weird because I was thinking about that as well. Because actually it's been on my mind all day because we had the addresses at the Congress from the students and academics from Birzeit, and the first group spoke about struggles for land and agriculture, and we also had the other group who was speaking about the struggles for education in Palestine. And I was thinking all day of the call of the students in Greece in the 1970s. I live in Greece. Who brought down the fascist dictatorship in Greece in that time, and their call was Psoumi pedia eletheria, Psoumi pedia eletheria, which means bread, education, and freedom. And what struck me listening to you speaking before, and you talking about this rift, is that the demands were concrete, but the call was poetry. The two things are totally, utterly intertwined. That wasn't my question. You raised Wittgenstein, who famously said that if the lion could speak, we wouldn't understand him. And I've realized recently that I think that's not true. I think we would understand the lion perfectly, and in fact, I think we can understand the lion perfectly now. And my point in saying that is that you started early on in your lecture. You spoke as if the poetry you were thinking arose from the olives themselves. From the olives. You talked about how the olives and how you could not speak of the olives without thinking of poetry. So I wanted maybe to return to that and ask you about this relationship between poetry and the non-human world, and the extent to which when we are speaking, we are making a connection with something that's much greater than us, that isn't just human, that connects us to the land, both the land that we stand on, but kind of to all life. And so poetry itself as a form of communal shared life, of all life, of the life force itself.
Yeah, just quickly, because
yes, please.
You are a bigger expert on this topic than me. Of course, I agree. I mean, actually, AI is now working on communicating with, dolphins and many other animals. And actually, I'm also here not an enemy of AI, if you want. I'm an enemy of monopoly capitalism. Actually, monopoly capitalism is an enemy of me. The problem is not technology, the problem is how it's used and the monopoly power of it. AI could actually help us tremendously to understand other species, and that's what's being shown these days. How it will be used, that's another question, because we can see that dolphins and other animals are being used either by the CIA or by Israel as well as sort of soldiers. Just to respond quickly, I think we are not even yet at the beginning of understanding the others, the non-humans. We are not even yet at the beginning, because we are so much stuck in the anthropocentric mindset and culture, which even with the term Anthropocene also kind of reinforces this human at the center of the world, you know, as if we are the most important ones who ever appeared on the land and on the earth, as if after us there will be nothing, as if before humans there was nothing. So in this sense, yes, poetry should definitely be a sort of communal thing which could unite other non-human entities as well. How exactly, I don't know. What I'm trying on our island, where we launched ISA, the Island School of Social Autonomy, and I know you're trying on your island, at Egina, is through working in nature, is through working with nature. Even when I built dry stone walls, which I have seen here in Palestine as well, it's a sort of communication with the stone. I know this sounds ridiculous and crazy, but you start to understand nature, history much better when you move one stone to the other stone, and when you understand that you don't need concrete or cement for these stones to be there for centuries or thousands of years. And in the same way, on the island, for instance, I'm for the first time noticing what is around me. I mean, I'm not a typical intellectual. I was a shepherd. My parents had sheep and goats at one stage of our lives. I mean, they were also businessmen, private businessmen, all sorts of stuff. But so I have an experience with animals. I don't eat animals for the last 30 years, so I'm not a cynical guy who preaches now here from the stage about this stuff. I'm trying to do as much as I can, and I can imagine that together uphill, where I work on the school, together with my dear friends, we are creating a kind of poetical little universe of communication or communication or sharing. Of course, in the face of the genocide here, it's a question, what does that actually mean? And I'm posing this question to myself every day. But that's, well, another or not another topic.
I would just first like to make a point on this dancing and revolution thing. I mean, yeah, both should be possible. But I think our slogan should also be, you have to be part of the revolution, even if you cannot dance in a revolution. But I wanted to ask you, Srećko, the examples, like the poems you presented today, and I mean, you opened your lecture with Bertolt Brecht, who is a kind of a prophet of hopelessness, like working, thinking from a position of being hopeless, being pragmatic, in a way. And all the poems you were talking about were also speaking from a position of knowing that you cannot prevent the catastrophe, that it's after or meanwhile the catastrophe. And at some point you were also talking about good poetry. So I wanted to ask you if you see a relation between like this position of hopelessness and good poetry, whatever that might be. So. And last question, maybe relating to that, my impression is that philosophers don't make good poets. Would you agree? And if yes, why?
I'm not sure. Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for instance, I think that's an amazing poetical work. That's not just philosophy. Perhaps I could find some others, but generally I think you are right. But that's why they are philosophers and not poets. But for instance, Bifo, whom I mentioned, he is both. When you hear Bifo talking, it's pure poetry. Hopelessness and hope. Let me be straightforward. I don't like hope. I mean, there was someone, maybe that's my privileged Western white position. I heard someone, a Palestinian today, was talking about hope, so I really try to be modest and careful what I will say, but knowing myself, I will not be careful. I don't like hope. I think hope is not a mobilizing factor. Hope is nothing. It doesn't mean that I don't hope. I mean, I hope I will get out of this country and will not have big problems because I want to see my child. I hope this genocide will end. But from my hope, the Palestinian peoples don't have anything from my hope. My child doesn't have anything from my hope. I'm much closer to the position of the great literary scholar Terry Eagleton, who published a book under the title Hope Without Optimism, because I'm against both optimism and pessimism. So I don't think hope is something which can lead us out of the deep shit in which we are. I think what we need is conviction and determination, and not hope. There is a nice conversation between Franz Kafka and Max Brod. I think it was at some war during the First World War or later, where Max Brod at one point asked Kafka, "So, is there hope?" And Kafka responded, "Yes, there is an infinite amount of hope, but not for us." And I think today we are in a kind of opposite position. There is still hope for us, but the question is whether there is hope for generations to come. And this is because of climate crisis, because of the war machine, and what is happening with Earth. So in that sense, I don't think that poetry which gives false hope can ever be good poetry. But what poetry gives is something else, I think. And it's also different from revolution, where you need conviction and determination. Poetry gives something which, is... We would need many more lectures to understand what poetry is. As said, it's difficult to say what poetry is, but what it does. And I think that's the difference between hope and the action which comes either through revolution, direct action, or poetry. You know, when you hope, you just hope, and it can happen or not. But if you have conviction and determination, or you have a poetical creation which goes beyond hope, then it's something to which I could describe.
And I have like last two questions.
Arabic or in English?
بالعربي. Okay. لازم نتعلم عربي عشان هيك.
Let me just put my fake ear.
السؤال، الملاحظة الأولى، يعني لما أنا بلشت بدي أحكي عنها، بس أخذنا الحديث في مسارات أخرى. لما بتبلش مع الزيتون، مع قطف الزيتون، بخطر في بالي العلاقة بين محمود درويش ولوركا، كارتيا لوركا، وتحديدا في العلاقة مع شجر الزيتون. يعني هاي اللحظة والاستمرار لها، يعني لهاي يعني علاقة الشعر بالزيتون ممكن تكون هناك مفيد التفكير. بس لوركا غايب عندك هون، ليش؟ هذا السؤال يعني حقك انك تغيبه، بس يعني بتخيل مهم. النقطة رقم 2 في نفس السؤال، يعني إذا بدي أرجع لبريخت، بريتولد بريخت، في قصيدته عندما يأتي الشر كالمطر المنهمر، بترجموها بالعربي هيك، بقول بأنه يعني لما بتصير الأموات أعدادها كبيرة، الموت، بتصير الصرخات غير مسموعة. بتفكر بأنه الشعر ممكن يكون هاي الصرخة اللي لسه إلها صدى، إلها إيكو في العالم، يعني في الحديث عن أو في الوقوف أمام المذبحة. هاي السؤال الشعري. السؤال مش شعري، الفلسفي فكري، تعمل يعني حوار بين سيزار وأدورنو، أوروبا والمستعمرات. أنا بدي أروح على مسار مختلف وأسألك عن بنيامين لما بحكي عن حالة الطوارئ، والتر بنيامين و state of emergency. وهل اليوم في عالم اليوم طلعنا برا يعني beyond أدورنو أوروبا وصرنا نحكي عن يعني مع التضامن العالمي مع فلسطين. هل أدورنو هل أوروبا لسه هي بين الانتلكشوال الأوروبيين تحديدا، ولا المستعمرات صاروا جزء من الحديث عن الاتروسيتيز في العالم؟ ولا يمكن هيك هايبربوليكلي سؤال، بلكي لانه احنا امتداد لاوروبا، يعني اللي بيحدث في غزه هو امتداد لاوروبا، وبالتالي عشان هيك احنا مهمين. يعني محمود درويش بقول مره في احد حواراته بانه اهميتنا كفلسطينيين مش لانه احنا فلسطينيين، بس لانه عدونا مهم. سؤالي اذا كان هذا لسه مستمر لليوم، ولا حقيقة احنا طلعنا برا، او اوروبا طلعت برا تاريخها الذاتي وبرا جغرافيتها المغلقة من خلال عمليات التضامن الاخلاقي اللي بيصير والسياسي اللي بيصير. سؤال
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure if I understood everything. Yeah, no, I'll try to answer, but you see, I mean, this is whole, I mean, talking is, every time we talk to someone is a sort of mistranslation anyway. So, Lorca is absent, but many others are also absent. I could have named many other poets. It's a decision by the autocrat who is sitting here and who gives the lecture, so that's my defense. First question. When you mentioned that the cries and the cry, in which way it has an echo in the future, I think, yeah, I mean that's the value of all great art, how it can travel back to the future, if you want, and how words, even when I was reading Paul Celan, Todesfuge, it's a poem which is not just about Auschwitz. That was my whole point. Although, of course, I know now some people will jump and say, yeah, but it's about Auschwitz. But my whole point is that through poetry you can universalize and you can actually show that this crime is part of a context of crimes and the processes. The more philosophical question you posed about Adorno, Benjamin, state of emergency, and Europe, and this relationship between the victim and the enemy, right? If I understood correctly. Well, I come from Europe, but I think Europe is a continent which is dying in two ways. First of all, the demography of Europe is sinking. It's a continent of old people. The natality rate also in my country, you know, Croatia now has 4 million inhabitants, which is a small Chinese village. According to demographic statistics, by the end of the century, it will be 2 million. Which would also bring us into a topic which is close to my heart, which is the topic of the nation state. You know, what does a nation state mean? If in the last several years we had an influx of several 100,000 migrant workers to Croatia, mainly Nepalese, Bangladesh, Philippines, and so on. So you could imagine that in a few decades there will be 2 million white Croatians, and there will be more than 500,000 foreign workers, which is like 25% of the population who have still no citizenship rights and so on. So who is Europe to preach about anything? I mean, I don't have to tell it to you. You know, there is this famous saying by a filmmaker from Africa who says, Europe is not my center. And in the same way, Europe is less and less becoming my own center. Not just because I come from the periphery of the European Union, not just because I come from a country which was part of the non-aligned movement, which was spreading around Europe in solidarity with the countries of the Global South and Palestine. Every summit of the non-aligned movement ended with the declaration that Palestine has the right of self-determination. And I'm not talking about the current non-aligned movement which still exists on paper. So in this sense, I don't think that Europe, on the one hand, yeah, Europe is dying literally for various reasons. Some speculations are that it's also connected to microplastics. I mean, that might sound crazy to you, but infertility, there are more and more scientific studies that that one of the causes might be microplastics. Other causes are, of course, the spoiled European way of life, where people don't want to have children, where 50% of the population are completely alone. And it's not just Europe. Go to South Korea, there are people, there is even a name, I don't know it, also in Japan, who don't want to have relationships, who don't get out of their apartments. I mean, that's the stage of luxury they have, that they could go out, unlike the Palestinians, and look at the birds or trees, but they don't want to go out. So in that sense, I think the Western imagination is dying. And so on the one hand, literally, on the other hand, philosophically, if you want. So in that sense, I'm really glad to be in Palestine, to meet you, to meet many other professors and students from Birzeit University, to read Mahmoud Dervish, to read Adania Shibli. Brilliant novel, Minor Detail. There is no novel like that. And in that sense, you can see that Europe is not the center anymore. That said, it doesn't mean that there are not good poets in Europe, that there are not some good philosophers. I named one at least. That doesn't mean that, but I think the continuation of the European idea of progress and modernity will not bring a revolution, a poetical revolution, because it just continues the same and the same. In a similar way what Adorno said, with all my criticism towards Adorno.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for شكرا جزيلا للجميع، شكرا لحضوركم. وبدي أحاول أنهي بمقطع من قصيدة لمحمود درويش، إذا بدك تحط محمود درويش بيقول في قصيدة حالة حصار بأنه خسائرنا من شهيدين حتى 8 كل يوم، و10 جرحى، و20 بيتا، و50 زيتونة، بالإضافة للخلل البنيوي الذي سيصيب القصيدة والمسرحية واللوحة الناقصة. شكرا.
شكرا.